Hello, I'm George King. I'm a member of the Essex Historic Military Vehicle Association, and today we're going to show you weapons that were used by the Allied forces on D-Day. The first weapon I'm going to show you is the Springfield 30 cal .30. These rifles were extensively used in the First World War, although an earlier version which had a groove here for the fingers in the forestock, and it's bolt operated like most First World War weapons, and this was carried by a lot of troops, rear echelon and back, the troops that came ashore after the actual landings, and it also came with a bayonet. This bayonet will fit it, but the original Springfields were a lot longer, and they decided that because of the shortage of steel, and they didn't need that much steel to kill a man, they shortened it accordingly. It's fitted with a rifle sling, which is quite common amongst a lot of American rifles. So that's a Springfield. It's got a flip sight and it's in nice condition. The second rifle is the first semi-automatic rifle adopted by any army in the world. It's an M1 Garand and it's a .30 caliber. It takes the standard bayonet, which we've already covered. It's fed by a clip of 8 rounds, and it's loaded by pulling the cocking handle back, pushing the rounds in and pushing them down, and the working parts will shoot forward and load a round into the breech. This, what I'm doing now, is what they call the grenade thumb. When releasing it from inspection, you push it down with your thumb, pull back on the hammer. If you don't get your thumb out in time, you get it caught in the hammer. That's the standard sling, the same as on the Springfield. The bayonet, as I've said, is the same. This bayonet is quite a rare bayonet. It's made by OL, and this was a 16-inch that they'd have used on the Springfield in the First World War, but they cut them down, and the way you can tell the difference is this fuller goes right straight off the end of the blade, whereas with a later produced one such as this one, you'll see the fuller stops before the end of the blade. That's how you can tell that it was cut down. This could also be used as a sniper's rifle. It's quite heavy. It done good service during World War II, and in fact many armies they still use these on ceremonial duties, especially the Greeks. This also is an M1 Garand, but it's fitted with a later canvas sling, and this thing on the end is a rifle grenade. This rifle, when being used for the rifle grenade, has this thing fitted on the side, and it's a sight, and I believe they use a ballistite cartridge in the breech, and it's fired by a cartridge which throws the grenade. Again, quite useful. Not as useful as an anti-tank gun, but it's alright for infantry. These would have been used extensively on D-Day. The next rifle is an M1 carbine, Now this version, again, it's a .30. This version is made specially for paratroops. It's lightweight, it's got a folding stock, and this would have fitted in a holster that was attached to the parachute harness. It has a smaller magazine. Although it's a .30, the actual cartridge is a lot smaller. You can see the rounds are a lot smaller, and that's done. Again, it's cocked with a cocking handle that flies forward, which loads the rounds into the breech. Quite useful. The trouble with this rifle, it didn't really have a lot of stopping power, and I'll explain that when I get to the standard version. So that was the paratroop version. This is the standard M1 carbine. As you can see, it's a lot heavier because of the complete wooden stock. Now this signallers and artillerymen used to be issued with a pistol, and because they found they couldn't really hit a barn door with it, they gave them each one of these. As well as the infantry had a lot of these, but they also had, signallers had them, radio operators, because it gave them some degree of accuracy. This one's got the pouch fitted with the 2 spare magazines. All in all, this is the M1A1. The M1, the paratroop version is the M1A1. Fires the same round. This is slightly heavier, obviously, but apart from that, it's a good rifle, apart from having no stopping power. The next weapon I'm going to show you is a 1911 A1 pistol made by Remington. It's exactly the same as Colt. Colt couldn't make the 45 quickly enough, so Remington got the contract as well. It's a standard sidearm. It's carried in, it's 45 caliber. It's carried in a leather or holster, or one that goes up here, the shoulder holster. It's worn on what they call a pistol belt, although it could also be worn on a cartridge belt, which is made of canvas with eyelets for moving the thing wherever you want all the gear to hang on it, such as water bottles. It's also got first aid pouch with a metal tin with a bandage in it, and on the back there is an M3 fighting knife. These weren't issued to everybody. Most people relied on a bayonet, but they were issued to certain forces. Quite lightweight, nice leather handle, and that was the infantry type. Now this one is a paratroop version. These were used by paratroops on D-Day. This one's actually got the chap's initials scratched into it. Slightly bent, but it's probably seen action, and it goes in a totally different sheath. Quite lethal. Quite expensive as well to buy. So that's the M3 fighting knife. Also, I've got on here the standard issue grenade, American. This used to be all yellow. When they first started using them, they were all painted yellow to show they were live, and they stopped that practice, and they used, as you can see, just a small yellow band on the top of the grenade. Unlike the English grenade, which is fed from the base for the detonator, this one comes as a screw-in fitting. It screws in. Once it's screwed in, the grenade is then live. I actually found one of these on Omaha Beach some years ago, and it had obviously come out of a box because instead of the lever, it had a wooden bung in it, so it just got washed ashore I picked it up quite safe, and I've got that now in my collection. So that's a pistol belt, Colt, fighting knife and a grenade. As a footnote to the M1 carbine, people who are issued with the M1 carbine, because the wartime M1 carbine never had fixings for a bayonet, there was no boss on it, that came out after the war, in the Korean War, they were issued with a fighting knife in absence of a bayonet. This next weapon is a 1918 BAR, which was Browning automatic rifle. This was used in the First World War in trenches. It's extremely heavy. It's also the same caliber, 30 cal. Very heavy. To actually carry this, you'd have to be quite hefty. I wouldn't definitely like to be lumbered with one of these to carry around for a few years. It's magazine fed, 20 rounds, and it's also bolt action. Extremely heavy, flash eliminator on the end, and there is no reason not to be strong after carrying this around for 3 years. I wouldn't like to carry it, I'd rather carry a pistol. Rather heavy, but extensive use all throughout World War II. That's the Browning automatic rifle. This next weapon you'll all recognise, it's the Tommy gun, Thompson submachine gun. This is the M28 model. It's got a thin barrel, front grip, pistol grip, and the butt detaches. It's got a flip sight. It's 45 caliber. It's got 50 round drum magazine, but it would also take a 20 round drum magazine. It doesn't give you that much firepower, but with the 50 drum magazine on, it's very heavy. This thing on the end is known as a cuts compensator, and what that does, as the flame goes down the barrel, this angles any blast upwards, which actually helps hold the weapon down, because it does tend to jump up in the air. It's a close quarter weapon, ideal for house clearing, street fighting. This was carried by English troops during D-Day, commandos and such. Wasn't extensively used by the Americans, although there are pictures of Americans using them, but not to any great extent. The reason I'm showing this one first is because this leads on to other models, which is what I'm just about to show you. Again, it's a Thompson. This one's got the 30 round magazine, no cuts compensator. It's got a straight military grip on the front. The sights are different. They're a cheaper version because of the mass production, and the cocking handle is on the side, unlike on the M28 where it's on the top. This will not take a 50 round drum magazine, whereas this 30 round will fit the M28. Again, it gives you more firepower. This was used extensively on D-Day, lots of paratroops, everybody, and armoured troops. A common trick was to take two of these together, one way, one the other, slightly offset, so that they could turn it round and reload quickly. It's got the standard type sling on it, which is the same as what's fitted to the BAR normally. So that's the M28, the M1A1 as opposed to the M28. The next one was used on D-Day. This is known as a grease gun. Again, it's 45 caliber. The reason it's called a grease gun because it looks like something you'd use in a garage. Again, it's got a stick magazine, which is 30 rounds, open flip top, and the cocking handles here. They did change this and put to get rid of this lever because it kept breaking, and they put a thumb thing in it and you could pull it back that way. It ejects to the right, so ideally you've got to be a right-handed person, because firing it from the left shoulder, if you fire it from the shoulder, you're going to get that in your face if you're not careful. It also has an extending butt piece. This pulls out so that it can be placed in the shoulder. Not used extensively too much on D-Day. A lot of paratroops had them, but as I said, this actually went into service in about 44. So therefore that's the grease gun. Nice original weapon in good condition. Okay, the next weapon is a 1917 A1 30 cal Browning. This is on the tripod. It's water cooled, and that's the water for the cooler. It's belt fed. The cocking handle, the top flips up, the rounds go onto the feeder tray. You then shut the lid, cock the weapon by pulling the handle back, and this will keep firing continuously at a great rate of fire. You can tell by the boxed ammunition. Brilliant weapon, used extensively in World War I, as did the Germans with their machine guns, and very effective weapon, very heavy. That's why the machine gun section normally had to be quite big lads. So there you go, that's the 1917 A1. The next weapon next to it, this is a 1919 A4. This was designed to give more flexibility to make the weapon lighter as well. Gone is the huge tripod, and a lighter tripod was brought into use. The water jacket was got rid of, and they used an air-cooled barrel. Again, it's the same. The top flips, you pull the lever back, the top flips, you put the rounds on the feed tray, shut and bang the lid, cocking handle back. This again would have been operated by 2 or 3 men. If you had to move, one would carry the gun, one would carry the tripod, and one would carry the ammunition box for it. Expend a lot of ammunition with these, so you had to obviously have good supplies. The next weapon, the one next to it here, is a 1919 A6. This again was a development from this one. This was to be used by paratroops. If anybody's seen any paratroop films, you'll see it. They done away with the tripod. They gave it a bipod up the front. Again, a air-cooled barrel, a carrying handle, which they had to redesign because it got in the way of the sight, so that it dropped. Again, the same receiver for it. The main difference at the back, you can see they made a metal butt for it, which clamps on with a butterfly. Again, quite heavy. I wouldn't like to have carried it for a few years. But a very effective weapon. Again, belt fed, same ammunition. So that's the progression of the 30 cal Browning from the First World War, modified for the Second, and this was modified even more for paratroops. So that's the 30 cal. The next weapon is a torpedo Bangalore M1A1. Although it's called a torpedo, it wasn't really used at sea. This was used extensively on D-Day, and it was used primary to break through barbed wire, or you could use them on a minefield. And the way they work is that they are pushed together, and you've seen this in the films where each man in a section will carry one, and they'll go forward one at a time, connect one to the other, the pointed end being the end that goes through the wire. So as I said, these are joined together, and when they're pushed far enough through the barbed wire, the fuse, which is in the bottom of the last one, it's either a strike or a light one, which explodes all the explosives inside the tube, which explodes, and this all breaks into shards and it will cut through the wire. Used very extensively on D-Day. You've probably seen them in the films. I think you see them in Saving Private Ryan. The last weapon I'll show you is the M1 bazooka. This is fired by batteries which go into this holder here. Apparently they had to carry these batteries, the spare batteries, under their arms to keep them warm because they never worked, and later versions had a gyro fitted in the pistol grip. The way these work is a rocket, this is the rocket, is inserted into the end of the barrel, the tube, and there's a wire comes off the end of the rocket, which is then wound round this spring. There's a spring there, and you just get the end of the wire, put it in there, let it go. He then takes an aim, and these are the sights, one there and this one. This, depending on how far away the tank is, there's 100 yards, 200 yards and 900 yards, sorry, 300 yards, and it was quite effective against armour. I'm not sure whether this would take a Tiger out, a bit iffy. I think if you hit it in the back or in the petrol tanks or somewhere like that, or perhaps the drive sprockets, you might knock it out, but then you only disable the tank. Quite heavy to carry. This banding round here, which is like a wire bound tightly round the back of the launcher, was put on because the early one, they found that with the rockets it sometimes made the barrel bulge with the heat, and the rocket wouldn't fly straight, it'd go off course. So they sent engineers out into the field to put these wire bands on. The rocket itself, this one which I've already had in my hand, is the early one. Notice the fins, and it's a squash head, which means when it hits the armour, the head squashes, and inside there's a charge that will burn its way through. It's only a small hole, burn its way through the armour, and the rest of this inflammable stuff goes through the hole. It will suck the oxygen out the tank, and it will set off any ammunition because it starts a fire. This one they abandoned because, as you can see, the fins are quite thin and they tended to get bent, and it put the rocket off course. And also they done away with the pointed end because if it was on a slanted piece of armour, it'd hit it and ricochet off. So they developed the later one. They gave it a better fin design on the end, which was less prone to damage, and they made the top sort of round, which meant that as soon as it contacted the armour, it wouldn't shoot off, it wouldn't deflect, and it'd do the job it was meant for. Two-man crew, one with the bazooka and one to carry the ammunition. That concludes my showing of American weapons.
Hello, I'm Peter Smith from the Essex HMVA. Following on from George's description of the US weapons used on D-Day, we're now going to look at the weapons used by the British and Commonwealth forces. The first weapons we'll look at are those used by the commandos because they're slightly different. the commandos used the First World War type rifle on D-Day, not exclusively, but those who did use it had it fitted with a cut discharger, and this was so that they could fire a standard number 36 grenade which had got a base plate fitted, and this enabled them to fire the grenades at a greater range whilst they were coming ashore. The troops who weren't armed with this carried the standard number 4 rifle, which we'll look at in a moment. As well as the short magazine Lee Enfield rifle, they also carried a bayonet for it, although this was rarely used. It was too long because it was a First World War design, and although they did have it, I think it was very rarely used. They also carried the famous Fairbairn Sykes commando knife, although again on D-Day probably not used that much. It was really for close quarter fighting and knocking out sentries. They were armed with the US 1911A1 Colt 45 pistol, in preference to the standard pistol, which we'll look at, the standard British pistol, we'll look at that in a moment. This fired a 45 calibre round, the same as the Thompson submachine gun, which was the other weapon of choice that they preferred. This is a 1928 model of 1928 Thompson submachine gun, which the commandos tended to use. They did have some of the later ones, as we saw in George's video. They tended to have dispensed with the round drum by D-Day and used the 30 round stick magazine. Quite an effective weapon, a lot of stopping power, and the commandos really liked it. They didn't want to adopt the Sten gun, which we'll look at in the second part of this video. So that's really an overview of the weapons used by the commandos on D-Day. Here we have the number 4 Lee Enfield rifle. This was the standard rifle of the British Army by this time in northwest Europe, based on the design of the First World War SMLE rifle, but redesigned due to a few problems, and the main thing was speed of production. This is a Savage made one, made in the United States. They produced millions, 4 million number 4 rifles were produced. The bayonet with this rifle, called a pig sticker, is much smaller than the First World War rifle bayonet. This was more suitable for the conditions that you would need in the modern fighting era. Not particularly well received, I have to say. It was never a popular bayonet because with the bladed type bayonet you could use it for things like can opening. This really was, other than a bayonet, was pretty useless for anything else. It held one thing I suppose I ought to mention: 303 cartridge, again standard 303 British, 10 round box magazine, which was an advantage over the Mauser and the Springfield, who only held 5 rounds. So it gave an advantage to the British soldier, and also it had a smoother mechanism which enabled them to get a lot more shots off. Moving on to the next weapon, we have the famous or infamous Sten gun. This is the Mark II version. The Mark I version really ended up only being given to the Home Guard. This was the weapon that was mass produced on a large scale, dropped to resistance, 9mm, because it used the ammunition that the Germans had developed for their submachine guns. Britain didn't have a submachine gun at the start of the war. They started buying a Thompson. They were too expensive. This design evolved at Enfield, the Royal Small Arms Factory. It was cheap to produce, effective, very basically made, used for short range house clearance, etc. It wasn't a long range sniping weapon, but for what it was designed to do, it was fairly good. This is the Mark III. This was even cruder and cheaper to make. These were made by Lyons Brothers, who were trying toys. They produced 1 million of them. Many of these, if you look at photographs of D-Day, you'll see them carrying these particular Mark IIIs. they were effectively disposable. The way they were manufactured, made of one single sheet of steel, spot welded along the spine at the top. The barrel was riveted in rather than being fixed, spot welded together in other places, so it really was a cheap weapon, and it was something that, if it was lost, it wasn't a great hardship. For the first time in Normandy, the airborne troops got a new version of the steam gun. This is the Mark V. As well as having wooden furniture on it, it can also take the number 4 rifle bayonet. Although the basic mechanism's still the same, I think the wood furniture made it look a bit more impressive, and the troops seem to have taken to it. As I say, this was used for the first time on D-Day, and it was issued to troops of the 6th Airborne Division. The standard revolvers that the British used were these Enfield revolvers. They also used a Webley because they couldn't produce enough Enfield revolvers. Unlike the Americans, the Germans and a lot of other armies, the British hadn't really adopted an automatic weapon as standard. They still persisted with the old-fashioned revolver. In the First World War they used a .455 calibre revolver, which had the kick of a mule and would certainly put somebody down. But it was very difficult to fire and took a lot of training and practice. So they decided on the eve of the Second World War in the late 30s that they would reduce the calibre to 38, which is what these are. I've read a lot about these, that these are more of a morale booster than anything. You're lucky to hit a barn door 30 yards away, so I suppose if you were ditching your tank and running off and trying to dissuade the enemy from taking you prisoner, maybe they'd have worked, but to be quite honest, I doubt it. This is an early one. This has got what they call a spur on it for cocking. But they found there was a problem with this. In a tank you could catch this on anything protruding and accidentally shoot yourself in the foot. So they brought out the later variant, which is a spurless revolver, and this is what they call a double action, so that when you pull the pistol it will fire without you having to cock it. And then finally, again, as we saw with the grenade launcher, this was the standard British grenade, offensive grenade, I add, the Mills 38. The problem with this grenade is when you threw it you needed to take cover, because the lethal range of this was further than you can throw it. No doubt you've seen the Hollywood films when they throw a grenade and then they rush in afterwards. If they'd have done that and stood up when they'd thrown this, they'd have got as much shrapnel in them as the enemy. This is the famous Vickers machine gun. 303 calibre, the same as the Lee Enfield rifles. Fires from a 250 round belt, kept in a box, and was used for sustained fire, that is, suppressing the enemy. It could fire, as with the 30 calibre water-cooled Browning we saw in George's video, continuously, provided you kept it fed with ammunition and water. It would fire all day and all night. Very, very reliable, but the one drawback with it, very, very heavy. In a trench warfare of the First World War, where it evolved from, it wasn't such a problem, but as the fighting in the Second World War became more mobile, it did cause some issues. That said, it was still used by the British and Commonwealth forces extensively because it was so reliable. For ease of movement, the British introduced the Bren gun in 1937. This is the Mark I, the first version. It fires from a 30 round box magazine, 303 calibre again. This was produced in peacetime, and so is finished to a very high standard with lots of fancy materials, stainless steel, etc. This was a butt handle for the anti-aircraft use. It was soon done away with, and it also uses a dial sight to alter the range setting. Again, very expensive to manufacture, quickly done away with, and a cheaper variant was produced, the Mark II, which was heavier because of the reduction in machining. By 1944, with the expansion of airborne forces and special forces, they wanted something a bit handier, and so by D-Day they had the Mark III, which was lighter, a shorter barrel, still 303, still 30, same standard box magazine, much lighter. As I say, it was a shorter length, so it was easier for parachute operations, etc. You can see the comparison if I put the two together, just how much shorter the Mark III is, and it's considerably lighter as well. The Mark I and the Mark II were still used for normal infantry troops. Here we see the British version of the Bangalore torpedo. Notice that it's a smaller diameter than the US one and longer. The Bangalore torpedo the British used before this was about a 3-inch diameter and shorter lengths, but it was very heavy. Probably having seen what the Americans had produced, they got a bit envious and decided they'd alter theirs, and they came up with this. You'll see images of these being used on D-Day, as you will with the US ones. For anti-tank use, whereas the Americans had the bazooka, the British had the Piat, the projector infantry anti-tank. A very, very heavy weapon, and it had the kick of a mule. Inside the main body is a very large spring, which you had to turn the butt through 90 degrees and cock, and believe me, it takes a lot of effort to do that. Once cocked, you could then load the weapon, which is a hollow charge weapon. This container on the fin is how they would come, inside which is the fuse. You'd remove the nose cone, take out the dummy fuse, and then refit it with the live fuse in here, and the weapon was now ready to use. The reason that they didn't fuse them and issue them is because the early fuses used with these were very prone to going off when you didn't want them. They were dangerous. Once you'd loaded the rocket onto the spigot, which would have been retracted, you then got your target and pulled the trigger. This would cause the spring-loaded spigot here to shoot into the back. In here was a very large shotgun cartridge, for want of a better expression, which would also be fired, and the combination of the spring pressure and the blast from the tail would fire the Piat round. Optimistically, a range of 150 yards. But having said, it would go through, in ideal conditions, 6 inches of armour. So, in theory, it could knock out any German armour. But having said that, you need to get very, very close to be effective. Hence, why a lot of people who used the weapon ended up with the Victoria Cross. For that very reason. It had one advantage over the bazooka and the German weapons, in that when you fired both of those, you got a back blast which gave your position away. Because this was sprung loaded and effectively like a shotgun cartridge, you didn't get that problem. So you did get a chance at a second shot if you were lucky enough, because when you fired this, the recoil, the blast from this was supposed to recock the weapon. But this didn't always happen, so if you were then fumbling to cock it and get a second shot off whilst the Germans were looking for you, you didn't stand much of a chance. We now move on to the German weapons used on D-Day. We're not going to look at every last one, because on the Atlantic Wall alone they used many captured weapons, and there are so many that the video will last about 15 hours. So we're going to concentrate on the main weapons that they used. The first one is their standard rifle, the K98K, K for carabiner. It's a shorter version of the First World War rifle. The bolt handle's turned down. Internal 5-round box magazine, fires a 7.29mm round, which was the standard German rifle cartridge. It had a fairly standard bayonet, similar to the US bayonet. Popular again because it was a blade bayonet, you could open your rations with it, and obviously fairly effective at what it was designed to do, to kill somebody. The other weapon of choice was the MP40, their standard machine pistol. Introduced originally as the MP38, the MP40 version was modified to make it easier to produce. Folding stock, folds out fairly easily. 30 round box magazine, fires 9mm, which is why the British chose 9mm for their Sting gun. Very reliable weapon, very popular, much prized as a captured weapon by US troops if they could get their hands on it. We now move on to the two standard pistols that the Germans used. The first is the Luger, again another First World War weapon. Very high quality, expensive to produce and slow to manufacture. And in the 1930s the German army began looking at whether or not there was something on the market that could replace it, and they issued a specification, and the result was the Walther P38. This won the competition. It was cheaper to produce, probably in my opinion a better pistol than the Luger. Internal magazine, as with the Luger again, fired the same 9mm round. Again a very popular weapon, especially as a trophy. American troops would virtually sell their soul to get hold of one of these to ship it back to the States. Again, probably another iconic weapon of the German Wehrmacht. Here we have the MG34 in a sustained fire mode on its Lafette tripod. This is how it would have been used if it was firing onto the beaches on D-Day. In this mode, it's the equivalent of the Vickers or the Browning 30 caliber water cord. Capable of 900 rounds a minute, the MG34 was still in production, although it had been taken over by the later MG42, which was quicker and cheaper to produce. The MG34 could fire around 800 to 900 rounds a minute, fed from a 250 round belt, 7.92 standard rifle ammunition. It could also be dismounted and used on a tripod with a belt again, or with a drum magazine, as is seen here on the MG42. This is the MG42. This was the gun designed to replace the MG34. It had a high rate of fire, 1200 rounds a minute. It was cheaper to produce because it was mostly metal, pressed metal stampings, and it was cheaper to produce. It could use the 50 round drum shown in this version, or be fitted on its own Lafette and fed from 250 round belts. Used on D-Day, there were at least a couple on Omaha Beach, where they accounted for a lot of the US soldiers who landed due to the high rate of fire and their positioning there. Very effective weapon, highly regarded and highly feared by the Allied troops. Here we have the Raketen Panzerbusch, or Panzerschreck as it was known to the troops, which was an anti-tank weapon. The Germans captured some bazookas in North Africa and sent them back for evaluation. They were developing their own anti-tank, a small anti-tank weapon called Pupschen, and combining the round of that, which they modified, they produced their own anti-tank rocket launcher, similar to the US bazooka. It was fired electrically. The difference was the size. Whereas the bazooka was a 2.36 inch, this is an 88mm, which is nearly 3 inches. Very effective weapon, and used heavily in Normandy. Something which was cheaper, which was almost a disposable weapon, was the Panzerfaust, the armour fist. This is the first version, which could certainly knock out any Allied tank. Throw away, pull the pin, raise the sight, aim, press the button and fired. very effective. As good as it was, they weren't happy with it, and they developed and kept on developing towards the war. This is actually a Panzerfaust 100, which had a slightly longer range and a better penetrating power. You can see that the launch tube is bigger, so it had more black powder in, which is what fired the rocket, and a larger warhead. This obviously could defeat any Allied or Russian tank at the time. You'll see images of these being used by children towards the end of the war. They were very simple to use. The only thing you had to be aware of was, similar with the bazooka, the backblast. Other than that, quite an effective weapon.
I hope you enjoyed watching the video from both of us, and I'm sure if we do another one you might like to join us again. Thank you.